Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back after lunch. I hope you enjoyed your lunch if you were here with us. If you're online, I hope you enjoyed a short break before we resume for this afternoon. My name is Ishan Kolhatkar. I am the Global Client Evangelist at Inspira, or as one of you said yesterday to me, you're the guy who said the things last year that got some people angry. That is indeed still me. However, this year, I am chairing a panel about assessment. The title is Envisaging the Future of Assessment. Assessment has a powerful influence on how students learn, something that's brought home to me by having my eldest child who is now in their first year at university. I have watched as they have gone from avoiding homework to seeing assessment as something they have to get done, actually, not that they're probably starting to enjoy assessment, but also having to start all over again at university and understand how assessment works. One of the greatest things about this conference is hearing from student voices and understanding what they want. I was struck heavily this morning by the student on the panel who was really prioritizing the time it takes to hear from us and what format they want to hear that in. When it comes to assessment, again, with small sample sizes of speaking to people like my children and others that I know that there is more of a barrier to asking about assessment. There's more of a reticence to ask and understand, and at the same time to engage with the resources that are out there to help make them better. My son is at university. There's a program, a course available to all students to help them do better at university. And I almost had to drag him kicking and screaming towards it to say, this is part of the secret of doing well and understanding how you do well. So over the course of the next hour or so, we're getting some questions for our panel. I've got some questions for them. You're able to ask questions using the Padlet, and I see that testing means that it must already be working. On this stage, we have 3 professorial titles, and a professor emerita, an honorary professor, multiple principal fellows of the HEA, a commander of the Order of the British Empire, Code Fellows, a UK National Teaching Fellow, a former Vice-Chancellor. And if you're thinking that's a lot of titles for 4 people, none of them are mine. That is just our wonderful panel. I did think about putting most improved right arm leg spinner in the under-9s category from 1987 on there at Totteridge Cricket Club. It felt incongruous with the rest of the list, but at least now you all know what I'm most proud of. As I ask questions and you think of the ones you want to ask, my plea to you is what I said to you last year if you were here, or at any conference you've ever heard me speak at, which is this. As a former barrister, my life was asking people questions. And I would ask that as you think of questions for the panel, please make them questions. And I will say to you what I used to say to my students on their first day. If you're having trouble forming an opinion into a question, who, what, when, how, why, describe, explain, all help you. Just stick that at the beginning, then say your thing, and it sounds more and more like a question. So that is my plea to you. But with that, I'm going to go over to our panel in a moment, just so that you know who they are and you will know many of them. We have Professor Chie Adachi from Queen Mary's University of London, which I'd like to point out is the best of the University of London institutions. That I went there is neither here nor there. Professor Naomi Winstone from the University of Surrey, and Dr. Patricia Broadfoot, who most recently was at the University of Bristol. So as I go and sit down to ask some questions, may I ask for a round of applause for our panel? The mic didn't follow me, that's nice. Right, okay, so panel. I have some questions for you, as you know, and I'm going to start sharing with you. If we were designing assessment from scratch today, what would we stop doing first?
Thank you, Ish, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. University of London, Queen Mary is one of the best, and I don't mean to be the person who would make you feel angry after this panel, so let's see how it goes. But thank you for such a triggered question, I think. To stop something kind of assumes that we're doing something not quite there, right there, and that I think is true. But also the sequencing is implied here, to stop first and what else do we have to think about. And so lots of people, I think, expect me to say something along those lines of exams. That's an easy answer. Not inclusive, traditional ordered assessment, and there's a surge of coming back to campus doing more exams because we are so scared of AI and human invigilation, and invigilation of any kind is sort of an issue. But assessment is not one simple thing. And I think that's the message I want to come across with this, is that to stop something is to think about assessment in isolation from something else. And I would encourage people to start thinking about assessment in relation to something else. Okay, so as a dean working with program teams on the ground, one of the things that I'm most struck by is their narrow view of assessment. When they're doing the module organisation at work and designing assessment tasks, it's their tasks in isolation kind of world. But in relation to others' tasks, in relation to, better yet, graduate learning outcomes and course learning outcomes, in relation to the program design, what does it look like to then design for the assessment, and then authentic assessment. So what does an assessment look like in relationship to the authentic professional practice that students need to be getting ready for? Assessment in relationship to feedback, and that's a segue for a feedback researcher here, Naomi. But what does it look like as a process to design assessment? So I'll stop at that in thinking about assessment in relation to something else, not in isolation.
Thank you very much. It's interesting the way that you couch in terms of if we think of stopping as something bad. I'm struck by, I would admit, my secret pleasure is watching videos of people falling over on Instagram. It takes up way too much of my life. But lots of these software companies have departments whose job is to kill things in the product. Scrum is one of them. Not because they're bad, but with the idea of finding something better. So I'm glad the way that you framed it. Thank you very much. Now, moving on to you. What do students understand about assessments that institutions often overlook?
Thank you, Ish. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. When I first started doing research on assessment and feedback back in 2010, 2011, one of the very first things that we did was to try and see assessment through the eyes of students, to try and understand what they see when they're literally walking through their programme and how assessment looks to them. And it's very different to how we look at assessment. One of the reasons for that is that for a student, assessment is a whole ecosystem, not just an individual module. Whereas for an individual academic, we see assessment in our module, we might understand what students are doing next or what they've done before. But for a student, assessment is so complex because it brings together all of the activities that are going on. And that means that things we need to be aware of, like deadline clustering, like inconsistencies between the way instructions are given to students, are really visible to them in ways that might not be to us. And this can be even more strongly exacerbated in distance education, where the opportunity for those corridor conversations that seek to bring some of these inconsistencies to light are not there, are not available. Another thing that we found when we were really trying to look at assessment through students' eyes is how much they try to understand the tacit expectations of assessments. Our assessment brief can be perfectly clear in our eyes, it can be really detailed, but students expect that there are hidden rules in the game and they try to find out what they are. And often this involves conversations between each other, but also trying to pick up on the cues from us. And I think what this tells us is making sure that conversations about assessment with individual students are not taking place behind closed doors, because it means some students are getting extra cues or extra little directions in the assessment that maybe others aren't. So I think that's an important point of inclusivity. The final point that I think comes up from what we found about students' view of assessment is how they do think strategically about assessment. If they've got multiple tasks that they're working on at the same time, they are going to become very aware of the trade-offs and think carefully about where they invest their efforts in one place or the other. That doesn't necessarily mean they're trying to game the system. It's just a natural way of managing a really complex set of demands that are on them at any one time. So I think what students see is a programmatic view of assessments. If we want to get a programmatic view of assessment, we have to sit down, we have to talk, we have to look at documentation. Students live assessment.
Entirely true, and it's no different than what we do in our own lives. We have 19 competing deadlines and make those decisions about trade-offs. I was speaking to a student in Southeast Asia a couple of years ago who said, do academics actually ever talk to each other when they set deadlines? Because it doesn't seem so. Patricia, I want to ask you about a different topic, which is how can assessment be designed to genuinely respect diverse cultural perspectives on learning and knowledge rather than assuming one academic norm? And I think in this room with this audience, that's a particularly pertinent question.
Yes, I think I got the short straw with that question, because if I knew the answer, I would be very rich and very famous. But I offer a few observations, because I think this is a subcategory of a bigger issue around the individuality of assessment, in that it seems to me during a long career that one of the biggest problems regarding assessment is that nobody seems to think about the impact on students, learners, as people. We're all individuals and we all have culture. And for me, the way forward has to be to try and find ways of individualising assessment and making it more personal. I used to often give lectures asking people to give an example of an assessment incident or an assessment they'd taken, what they felt about it. And almost universally, the result was anxiety, frustration, and all sorts of negative emotions, which are, to me, anathema to learning. So the first thing I'd like to say, I think, is that assessment is a really blunt instrument, and that's not thought about nearly enough. The second thing, I think, is that we already know how to make assessment more individual, more culturally targeted. There are examples going back to, I wrote a paper in 2016 offering examples of people who've innovated different ways of assessment using portfolios, using online technology-enhanced methods to allow students to demonstrate their learning at times and places and ways of their own choosing, which were much more valid than we currently do. There's a sort of subtext of examinations here this afternoon, I think, which for me anyway is anathema. I'll say more later. And the last thing I would say is that assessment, formal assessment, say university finals, exams for degrees, is a very, very blunt instrument and doesn't have to be like that. We could be much more orientated towards competence. And if we were, rather than competition and grading students against each other, rather than grading them against a standard, then the issue of culture, I think, would be much less difficult, because we would all be working towards a similar goal.
The 2016 paper is one that I definitely want to read, because I think that I certainly, for those of you here last year, you'll know that one of my personal points was that writing isn't my best way of expressing myself. So really, really do want to see that. I want everyone to know we are 16 minutes in, and it took that long for me to say AI, and we didn't say it before that. So if you have that on your bingo card, well done. But there does need to be some questions, because AI raises its head in assessment all of the time. Naomi, we'll start with you on this one, please, if I might. Is AI capable of grading work and providing feedback to an academically acceptable level? And if so, do we need educators in assessment and feedback processes?
So to me, the first part of that question is very easy to answer. The second part is slightly more complex. Can AI generate feedback comments to an acceptable level? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean it can do feedback. Because if you talk to me or any of my colleagues working in the area of feedback, we would say that comments are not feedback. They're information, they're an input into a process. So yes, AI can do the input bit, but that doesn't mean that it can do feedback. And I would argue that it could never replace humans in a feedback process, because of a process of feedback which involves everything that happens right from the time that we start working with students through to the end of their program of study. We are working with them in feedback. That's how it should work. So when we think about feedback as a process, we're interested in things like trust and opportunity, designing opportunities for students to use feedback and to work with feedback. That means human level design. I'm always coming back at the moment to Jackie Tuck's brilliant research on assessment as a social practice, and how when we write feedback comments to our students, the feedback is doing much more than just the words on the page. She talks about how in feedback we attend to the backstories of students. And even if we're marking anonymously, we still understand what our students are doing, where they're coming from, what important things might be happening. And so we do more than just write words, which I think is really, really important. And this is magnified in distance education, I think. When students rarely meet their tutors face-to-face, feedback becomes the most important signal, I think, of social presence and care. So we recently published a manifesto for feedback in an age of generative AI, and in this we argued for feedback as a process, for the relational and care-driven elements of feedback as a process. And one example of how I think this is going to be really important moving forwards, we've recently done some work with prisons in Australia, working with students, incarcerated students studying degree level qualifications whilst they're in prison. They literally never see the people who mark their work. And if they want to talk to them, they need to write them a letter and wait for the reply to come by post. But feedback can still work. And what we've been developing is a new platform called Feedback in Power Tools, which is designed to support learners where feedback is a process, where they may not have that chance for face-to-face dialogue. So yes, AI can write feedback comments, cannot do feedback because feedback is more than comments.
And it's that nuance that sometimes I think gets lost in the conversation we like the two. Patricia, again, I'm going to apologise because I'm going to ask you a massive question, which, if you have the answer, you would be here, unfortunately. So I'm glad that you don't have a full answer, because then you are here today. And it's, will AI transform or undermine assessment education?
Well, you'd be pleased to know, Ish, that I do have an answer to that,
Good.
which is both. It will transform. I'm sure all of us in this room listening to various conversations here are talking about AI, because we all recognise that AI, GAI, is going to absolutely transform the business of education. We haven't seen hardly any of that transformation yet. And it is going to challenge students and teachers in quite new ways. I think the only example that I can come up with is, can you imagine a world without trains even? Something simple as that is much, much more pervasive than that. So it's going to change curriculum and pedagogy, and hence it will need to change assessment. I've written in so many places, I cannot understand why we're still using a technology in assessment which was invented by the Chinese 3,000 years ago, i.e. written examinations. And we've been doing it, we invented it again in 19th century Britain and exported it all over the world. And I've been puzzling why it hasn't yet changed, hasn't yet been a revolution from that. And I think that the things that I've come to is that it's about legitimacy, what the public understand and accept, and it's also about inertia, I suppose is the word. It kind of works, and so we keep on doing it. But it's increasingly, hugely out of step with what we need to do today in our universities and our schools. And so recent paper that I've written about AI and its impact on society through assessment, we came up with the notion that there will be new things that students have to learn, particularly the notion of how to use AI. We know that 95% of students currently use AI. It was reported this week from the Higher Education Policy Institute. So it's already with us, but they need to learn in the curriculum how to use AI, how to prepare themselves for the world of work in the future. And so we're going to see a transformation and it comes back to what I was saying earlier, really, that we need to find a way of making assessment fit for purpose. And I come back to the point, if I may, 1 minute, about personalisation, because it will be possible to prepare students as lifelong learners, which means new assessment tools. One of the things that I've done in the past is design an self-assessment tool which assesses your capacity as your learning power as a learner. The tool is called the Evaluating Lifelong Learning Inventory, and currently, I'm delighted to say, being used in all schools in South Australia, where they have already recognised that a transformation is needed in not only assessment, but curriculum pedagogy. And I said a minute ago that the tool's already there and being developed for how to assess people as individuals using technology, but I'm not quite sure how we take our governments with us.
I certainly don't have an answer for that. One of the things that the panel now, I was keen that we got from this panel discussion, aside from the great answers we've had so far, is things you can take away with you. So the remaining questions do have a tinge to them of things for you to take away and think about. If I had a panel outcome that I'd said at the start, it was that there'd be one thing from this panel, at least one thing you can take away and discuss at your institution. So I'm hoping in the next few, you'll definitely, if you haven't already got one already, take something away. So, Chie, what is one practical change an individual academic could make next year that would genuinely improve the student experience of assessment or feedback?
Thank you. Such a pointy question again, isn't it? Lots of line on this. And because of the AI conversation, I want to kind of pick up on that and not to simplify assessment work. I mean, lots of people are busy, and to change something in practice takes time and effort. So I want to acknowledge that up front. And often small changes make a big difference, especially for students. And here I recall the good book called Small Teaching Online by Adachi, who also presented at the Cold Weddings recently. And so small changes make a big difference is one message. But do something with AI in a way that really works for you and for your students and in your context. And Patricia talked about the employability angle, the graduate attributes level. And so if you can think of an AI literacy, digital literacy into your curriculum, into your assessment, do something along those lines. And there's another beautiful paper by Thomas Corbing et al. About structural versus discursive changes in assessment. And so when we think about changes into assessment, there are things that you can do discursively. And so things that we tell students to do, but there's no way of actually demonstrating that that change has been enacted and used by students. And there's other types of changes, whereas the structural changes where you put something into your assessment design that students have to do with that assessment change. And so there's a range, again, that you can do in assessment design change. Now, even having that conversation with students, what it means to use AI in your context. And so in my context, it's a medical education, for example, then students using AI in clinical practice is very different from using AI in learning and assessment. And what does it mean if students are using AI of some kind into their assessment work? It's a scary space. If your university has a policy to back your argument, that's great, but not all universities yet have those policies, so we need to acknowledge that. But having that open space, safe space, where you can interrogate what it means to use AI for certain things like learning, assessment, and clinical practice, really brings that trust building exercise that Naomi was also talking about, and then creates that culture of transparency, legitimacy, and building that learning and assessment as a process. And so I would encourage that to be one of the changes people think about. What's happening really concerning at the moment is the digital divide really increasing. So those students who know how to use AI for certain things, they're going to continue to do well. And especially in assessment, this is what's happening. And then those students who have resources and money to pay for pro license of ChatGPT, they're doing better. And we're not seeing that. And so, again, going back to creating that safe space where people can discuss those challenges and opportunities that they are having, but also support that literacy to be developed inside assessment, inside a curriculum. That would be a really nice change that people can think about. It's simple, right? It's simple.
It is, and it takes a couple of points to be made before. The thing that is said quite often is, does a student have a pro license versus access to a free version? The stat recently that 95% of students are using AI. I wonder what the actual numbers of using it effectively. I mean, if you put in the thing that the course is how many R's and get a strawberry, aside from the fact that it's not great use of generative AI, if you don't know how to use it, that is a barrier. So yeah, completely. The next question is to Patricia, which is, if assessment shapes what society values in education, what might today's assessment practices be signalling, intentionally or not?
And I think there's a bit that goes with that, which is, does it matter? And it matters hugely, because, as I said earlier, we need to equip, in education, we need to equip students for the lives they are going to encounter and the workplaces they're going to find themselves in. I think that at the moment, society values academic learning above other kinds of learning because of the historic legacy of the kinds of things that we can assess through traditional assessment practices and other kinds of assessment which are even older than formal written examinations, such as assessing your competence in craft activity, carving or silversmithing or something like that. I think we need to, first of all, challenge the huge domination of competition in our assessment system, even in higher education, but worse in schools, because schools are the funnel that gets us to higher education. But there's still an awful lot of instrumentalism coming through the assessment system, where students are, quote, trading for grades. And I see a transformation coming along the line, coming along the rails with AI. And I do think, as I hinted earlier, and I'm sure there are lots of examples in this room of technologies or approaches that people are developing to challenge that orthodoxy that is coming from governments around the world who only care about standards and how well their assessment systems are trusted or compared with other countries' assessment systems. So I'd like to emphasise the 2 points I made earlier. One of them is teaching students, as you said, Ish, to be good at AI. And there is an issue about access to technology, which is also important, but that's not the question you asked. But to be good at AI is this notion of connoisseurship. And perhaps one of the things I'd have you taken back today from this discussion is the notion of how do we assess connoisseurship, i.e. the ability to use AI well in your learning. But the second thing that goes with AI, I think, is that institutions will want to know that individuals that they're teaching have actually done the work, the worry about AI and cheating and all that. So there's an issue about authenticity. How will we ensure that we know that the student has actually done what they say they've done? Because that goes along with everything, and that's fundamental to good assessment too. One final thought from me. If I had asked you to take one notion away from this discussion, apart from what I just said about connoisseurship and authenticity, it is fitness for purpose. We use assessment so badly because most people throughout the ages have not thought about whether the assessment techniques that they're using are actually producing the outcomes in terms of student learning or indeed the information that they actually want from that assessment. So it's about validity and reliability. But think about whether the assessment is going to have the impact in terms of student values that you want it to have.
There's a nice link there because the question on the poll everywhere, what it was called, at the top really does relate to that. So we'll definitely come back to that point in a moment. Chie, question to you. If we meet again in 5 years' time, assuming Linda invites you back, what would you hope has genuinely changed about assessment and what would it take to get us there?
So again, I really struggle with this question. 5 years' time feels like a long time, right? I think. If you think about what happened in 2023 with ChatGPT arrival, so much has changed. So you really can't predict what might happen in the next couple of years, really, even. So let me be radical to reimagine this space. I think when ChatGPT 5 is hinting at scientific discovery, and in a couple of years' time, people say the general artificial intelligence will really arrive. When that happens, I think knowing something means really less. Knowing something in that specific domain of knowledge means very little. When that happens, what really matters is that human nature of what we always talked about in terms of graduate attributes. And so how do people work ethically in teams, they lead others, and the critical thinking to be able to evaluate the currency and validity of information. And I think that's essentially what we're trying to do in assessment, so that students can demonstrate those attributes, but also skills and behaviors. And so in the assessment space, the design work would more look like focusing on into those human-centered skill sets. So how do we explicitly align our course learning outcomes with the graduate attributes and then develop those skill sets more specifically? Because the interdisciplinary section has happened has been here with us for a long time. When we think about, for example, fintech, finance, and technology, those disciplinary areas coming together has been sort of not new. But what would be new is to really hone into the human-centered skill set. And then if that was the case, what would it take us to get there? More radical collaboration, the radical partnership to bring in different types of voices and bodies of knowledge. And I'm including EdTech industry as well in this, as well as government and different types of bodies of members of the society, but EdTech in particular. We've been doing work with Colours, Inspira, and the assessment platform. And what they have been really good at is to bring institutions together. So across globe, and I know you do that too, Inspira, we as universities can be isolated and tend to be in our own worlds at the university level. But what industries and governments bodies can do is to bring those cross-sector, cross-national and international voices to be heard and create something. Working on a development of Viva to what as part of that cycle and diversifying assessment. And so that kind of partnership would be really welcome. And that's sort of what might get us there in 5 years' time that we can't really predict.
Yeah, and we can see some of the other questions coming in related to that, because I fully agree, not just from an EdTech perspective, but if you're going to try to think about how things are going to be different, you need to widen who's in that room quite considerably, if only to perhaps validate ideas, but also to hear the exact opposite of what you're thinking and the value of it. So, last question from me is to Naomi, which is, we've spent years improving how we give feedback. So, subjective, same thing, except what do we still misunderstand about how students use it? Certainly, I remember the difference between my students who would take a piece of paper with the feedback I'd given them for a piece of advocacy and study it in detail and ask me hundreds of questions, and the ones who in one swoop would take it from the desk and screw it up and put it in their bag. Those are the two ends of the scale. But what do we misunderstand more generally about how to use it?
Yeah, thank you, Ish. I think this question perfectly illustrates the problem. We have spent too much time, too much effort focusing on feedback as the delivery of comments, rather than recognising that the point at which comments are given to students is the start of the feedback process, not the end. And this was beautifully illustrated to me about 10 years ago. I was doing some work for another university over the summer, and I shan't name them, but they were very smug about how high quality their feedback was, that how much they gave in terms of words because they'd counted it, and how detailed it was. And I walked through a corridor, and at that time there was still the return of hard copy work in pigeonholes. Remember those? And these were stuffed full of unreflected assignments. And it was the middle of the summer, and the students had gone home. And I affectionately called this a feedback graveyard, because there was so much feedback there that had just died and was never going to be seen. And that university may well have believed they were doing feedback very well, but I would argue feedback was not happening because nobody was even looking at it. And the same thing we see in studies that look at how often students open feedback files on VLEs. Again, we have online feedback graveyards as well as in-person feedback graveyards. So, what do we do about it? We need to bring more visibility to the processes of using feedback, and we can do that through design. We can do that through assessment designs where we actually give credit to students for how well they engage with and use feedback to improve their work. And this is a really useful approach in the time of generative AI as well, because we're assessing process over product. The other thing I think we need to be really careful with when we're thinking about how students are engaging with and using feedback is seeing students engage with comments on the surface doesn't mean they're learning through feedback. So let's try a thought experiment. We have a student, a bit like the ones you've just described, as a student who reads feedback. They're told there's something they need to change. When we see their work next time, they've changed it. We might think, great, they're really good at using feedback. On the other hand, we might have a student who, next time we see their work, hasn't made changes that we suggested. That does not mean they haven't engaged with feedback. They could have engaged in really deep reflection on that information, that advice and guidance we provided, and decided not to act. And that is still engagement. That is still learning about our own work. And the application of feedback is not linear and it's not immediate. We often think that if we give students comments on one piece of work, they'll use it to improve the next one. It might be a year before they have the chance to really apply those comments, and it might not even be in the same type of task. So perhaps the reason why we focus on giving feedback is because it's so much easier to measure and it's so much easier to observe. Understanding how students use feedback is much more complex, but it's absolutely essential if we want to see feedback as a process.
Really like the idea of giving credit for engagement with it. That's great. Okay, so before we turn to you, the audience, I did say to the panel that they could have about 60 seconds to make a final comment. So I'm going to stick to that. Patricia, may I come to you first, please?
I thought the final comment was after we'd heard the questions, which I would prefer.
Oh, right. Well, let's do that. Okay, so Linda, we've got the poll everywhere.
If you got the table, if you haven't yet logged on, if you're in the room, I should be doing this on there. It's people online can't.
There we go.
Apology.
That's right.
If you're online, please use poll everywhere. If you're in the room, you can use poll everywhere, and there's a little link here, or you can raise your hand and I'll run round with the microphone. I've had too much cake for that, I can tell you.
While we're waiting for, well, I can see one hand up. I can see another hand up. I was going to go with one on the screen first. I'll take that off there. I'm actually going to go with the second one. I know they're tied for top place, but are we fetishizing authentic assessment? Who would like to go first?
Naomi, I'll let you go first.
I think one of the problems with authentic assessment is that we think about it in terms of tasks rather than processes. We think about, is this an authentic task? And often the fact that it is an assessment task means that it isn't authentic in the same way that it might be if it's happening in the real world context. Whereas if we think about the processes that underpin the completion of a task in professional practice, then I think we're more likely to develop meaningful assessments rather than just trying to find tasks that look like the kind of things students might do in the real world. And I think this links again really nicely to what we can be doing in response to generative AI, which is to stop thinking about which tasks we can or can't use. It's not the case that essays are finished because LLMs can write them. We just need to change the way that we assess them. And I think it's the same with authentic assessment. If we stop thinking about it in terms of tasks, but instead shift towards authentic processes that we can assess, I think it makes it more meaningful.
Chie, did you want to add something?
Can I do a quick plug on a paper that talks really nicely about this?
Please.
It's by Tim Fons et al. Called Authentic Assessment from Panacea to Criticality. And then they talk about demystifying what authentic assessment really is, and it's not silver bullet, is the essence.
I'm going to take the third one on here because I think it links nicely to it. And it was also something that Patricia said earlier. Much university assessment is disposable. What would it take for assessment to become more renewable and social, where students create work that actually matters beyond the course? And this was a discussion on my table with the assessment workshop we did, which was sort of getting into, should students leave with a transcript or a portfolio of things that they've done? So who would like to go first? Patricia.
I saw this question and I thought, wow, that's a great question, because it's really creative thinking about what the future might look like. The assessment is not necessarily done by the teacher, but done by the students themselves, who decide what they want to, how they want to assess themselves on a task they've done, with the help of AI, as we heard earlier. And I think, as we've already agreed, it is a profoundly social activity. And so I don't know quite what renewable means, but I get social, where students create work that actually matters beyond the course. How wonderful that is. I mean, that is what universities were like in 1400 AD, that students went to read for a degree and thought about what they wanted to think about. And now they've become so much like hamsters on the wheel, that this offers a vision of the future of a genuinely learning institution. Great.
I'm going to ask a very quick follow-up before I go to Linda, which is what might we envisage that product being? Because for some people in the room, they might remember having a national record of achievement, that burgundy folder, yes, that lives in a cupboard or an attic, or I open it from time to time and see embarrassing photos of myself in it. We're not looking at that, surely, Patricia?
Was quite a strong movement a number of years ago now for a higher education achievement record, the HEAM, which was exactly that. Like I didn't know you had a national record.
I am that old, I promise.
It didn't sustain. It wasn't sustained because we didn't then have the technology to support it. But we could a portfolio in whatever way somebody wanted to make it is clearly more possible than ever now.
Absolutely. Right, over to Linda, who has a question at the back of the room.
So I wanted to know the panel's thoughts about grading or pass-fail assessment.
We'll go to Naomi first.
Brilliant question. And I think this is one of those topics that we will still be debating in 10, 15 years' time, because no matter what somebody's beliefs are about ungrading, or this idea of removing grading, going to pass-fail assessment, competency-based assessment, for example, systems and structures will probably not budge enough to be able to enable us to do that. But I wonder whether generative AI might actually be a bit of a catalyst here, because I think when we're talking about pieces of work that students produce, it makes very little sense to value the polish of the final piece of work now, because that's no longer something that is a human capacity. purely. And if we're instead interested in looking at the processes, are students demonstrating the skills that we want them to be able to demonstrate in a particular task or process at work? It's much harder to grade that or to differentiate performance in process. We've been very good at differentiating performance in product. So I wonder whether generative AI might be a catalyst to help us think differently about assessment. Whether we go completely ungrading, I don't know. Maybe we might move little steps in that direction, but I believe systems and structures are the barriers that will prevent us from large-scale change in that sense.
Patricia, you want to add something?
Well, I feel very strongly about this particular issue because it seems to be grades are a code. I mean, numbers mean in themselves nothing, but they are a very good illustration of how students are enculturated to value their work in terms of somebody else's code and not their own feelings. And I do think that it should become possible. I was thinking years ago in the School of Education at Bristol University, in our master's work, we didn't grade the assignments, we just said pass, fail. And it worked perfectly well for ages until the university said, you must give it a code, so you must grade it. And that's illustrative of the institutional pressures that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I thought of a program that confusingly had competent, very competent, don't know how it is, and outstanding is the three great boundaries, but there we are. I'm going to take the second question on here. Programmatic assessment has been called for over years in UK higher education, but how do we reconcile this with developments in online learning and policy initiatives like LLE that are nudging us towards disaggregated modular study? Chie,
yeah, I can take that one. So there's one thing to be acknowledging about this space is that adult learning, professional learning, in the employability agenda sense, really recognizes that shorter forms of qualifications really very much needed. But the foundation around that is it stacks up to a degree course, should that be needed at some point. And so I think that's a fundamental principle that we're all buying into when we think about lifelong learning entitlement kind of thinking. And it's true that professionals are very busy and they are time poor as well as resource poor. And so they can't afford either of the qualification type big investment money, but also the time. And so when we break them down into shorter forms of qualifications, what does assessment look like in that is a sort of what's behind this question too. And just yesterday, I went to one of the presentations by Cambridge online group when they were creating a 4-week online course on biomedical research methods module. What they talked about, one of the 3 things that they did, and this was wrapped around the authentic assessment design kind of idea. One of the things that they talked about, and I really loved this, was the minimum viable professional practice as an assessment. And so when you think about the learning outcomes to be achieved by those really busy clinicians or lab scientists, what are the essentials of the capabilities that they need to demonstrate? And they really reduced it to minimum viable product, the artifact that they needed to demonstrate and create. And then that's sort of building nicely on the idea of authentic practice, but also what's really minimum and down to what's at the core. And so I think we can dissect this question by modular, but also in the space of the professional practice, authentic assessments.
Yeah, the different contexts in which those learners exist, I suppose, as well. Linda, question?
Yes.
I had a question.
Yeah.
You can't let him ask a question, he's not wearing his hat.
Yeah.
Oh, right, there we go, the hat's on, he can now ask his question, that's fine.
So I had the NSS question because I've spent many times debating this with them. So really it was a question just on there briefly about the power or the problems really of the NSS, the assessment and feedback bit that nobody seems to crack yet. And really, I guess I wanted to ask the question like, what could we be asking? What should we be asking institutions that genuinely would give us an impression of how useful we're being in this space? What are we not asking students that we should be about how good assessment feedback is?
Thank you, Chris. This is my favourite question in the world to talk about the NSS, which has done, I think, us a real disservice in assessment and feedback in higher education.
Sorry, Naomi, just before we go on, because it's very international here, it's the National Student Survey that's sent out to all students at the end of towards the end of their undergraduate degree. It has a set of questions that are asked of every student, and there's a section on assessment and feedback.
Thank you. And there are equivalents in many other countries as well. And in fact, the study that we did a few years ago, where we basically asked the question, are we valuing what we measure or measuring what we value in student evaluations? And we collected as many of these national student surveys that we could from across the world, and analysed the questions on assessment and feedback to see how they position students. Did they position them as passive receivers of feedback comments, or did they position them as active agents in feedback processes? And bar 2 of the international surveys, all of them, including the UK National Student Survey, position students really passively, asking them to rate the quality of what they receive or the speed of what they receive in terms of feedback, which first of all goes against all the scholarship, which is saying feedback is more than information. Second, doesn't reward people who are really trying to develop feedback as a process and student agency in feedback processes. And third, we know that the way in which the language used in these items actually serves to reinforce students' own perspectives of their role. So are we perhaps telling them that your role in feedback is simply to passively receive comments, because that's how we're asking you to evaluate its quality? So I think there's a real risk there, and we petitioned quite strongly for changes to the National Student Survey, and there were some very small changes that came through, but not as much as we had called for in the feedback items. So in terms of what we do differently, there's a really interesting parallel from the school context here, where previously, when Ofsted, which is the National Inspectorate of Schools in the UK, when they used to go into schools, they would spend ages looking at children's books to see how much feedback was being given by teachers and how high quality it was. Because teachers were then spending ages writing comments and books that were never seen, Ofsted switched their emphasis, and they said, we now don't want to see so much about how much feedback you're providing. We want to see evidence that your pupils are learning because you're giving them feedback and talking to them about their work. So the extreme changes that we pushed for, which were too extreme clearly because they didn't happen, was to ask these evaluation surveys, to ask students to evaluate how well they were enabled through the design, through opportunities to actually engage with and use feedback, not just asking them to rate how much they got, how good it was, or how quickly it came to them.
Yes, not the on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your favourite colour in the alphabet type question. Right, with that, we come to our end point. So our 60 seconds for each member of the panel. So Patricia, may I come to you first? It is the right order.
I've got 2 things I want to leave with you. The first thing is that change is coming. Absolutely revolutionary change is coming to society. We all recognise and talk about, and we need to think about what that means in terms of how education in every respect is going to change. And for me, that links to making the student, not the teacher, putting them in the driving seat of what is going to be done. And I love your last answer, because it is so pertinent to empowering students through self-assessment as well as feedback. It's such a sort of passive relationship that we've generated over the decades. And what we need for the future is a student saying, I'm weak on this, I need to learn that. Or, I'm interested in this, I want to do this. And the world is there for them to do it. So we have to think differently about the student role.
Thank you very much. Mary, over to you.
So much as the current situation we're in with generative AI is incredibly challenging, really driving lots of additional workload and uncertainty, I think we can reframe it as an opportunity. And for anybody who was involved in supporting large-scale assessment change during the COVID-19 pandemic, you will remember that there were all sorts of things that we were told we could never do before that suddenly we could, miraculously, because we were in this crisis situation. And I think there is that sense that with crisis comes opportunity. And we are lucky in higher education in that we do have more agency over our practices and our assessment design in the ways that school education doesn't. The assessment design in schools is set. Teachers have to work to what the exam boards are setting. We have a lot more agency. And so this is an opportunity for us to say, what do we want assessment to look like in the future? Having said that, there is no answer, there is no correct answer. Thomas Corbyn and colleagues frame AI and assessment as a wicked problem because there is no answer, and it's one that requires iteration. So the message I'm giving to everybody that I'm working with on assessment change at the moment is, do not try and find the perfect assessment design in response to generative AI. Just try and make it more valid than it was before. And if we keep taking those steps every year and commit to iteration, we will see quite large scale change, I think, as a result of generative AI.
Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you. Professor David Bowd, the assessment researcher, once said, and everyone quotes this, assessment drives learning. And to this date, I think it's true. But in this case, learning, I mean institutional learning. We just spent 1 hour talking about assessment. And so assessment does for lots of things for lots of different people and not just students. And we as institutions in the age of AI, learning a lot, being disrupted. And I think in a way, we're having an existential moment of what university really means and what it means to earn a qualification that is uniquely your own and humans' achievements of learning that's just happened. And so it's a really interesting and disruptive moment. And Naomi and I met just around pandemic time, but she is right in saying we can't go back to where it was. We are learning continuously to keep moving forward. And I think this is an opportunity for us as universities.
Patricia, Naomi, Chie, thank you very much for your time. Audience, thank you for your questions. Thank you everyone online as well for listening.